The crystalline dust caught in Vena's throat as she drove her plasma drill deeper into the cavern wall. Her elongated fingers, evolved for the delicate manipulation of light-sensitive flora on her homeworld, now cracked and bleeding from endless cycles of mining work. The neural inhibitor at the base of her skull hummed quietly, a constant reminder of her enslavement to the HFY mining consortium. 20 years had passed since the slave raiders had descended upon her small agricultural settlement. 20 years since she'd last seen the triple moons of Solara rise over the horizon. Now, her world consisted of the cramped tunnels of asteroid mining station K-379, where the HFY extracted precious quantum crystals used in faster-than-light drives. "Keep moving, specimen." The harsh voice of Overseer Grax cut through her thoughts. His tentacled face mask filtered out the toxic dust that slowly killed the slaves. Production quotas are falling behind. Vena adjusted her grip on the plasma drill, its familiar vibration numbing her hands. The protective goggles she wore, a cheap pair that barely filtered the crystalline particles, fogged up from her rapid breathing. She was one of the few Solarians who had survived this long in the mines. Their species' natural affinity for sensing energy patterns made them particularly valuable for locating quantum crystal deposits, but their physiology wasn't built for such brutal labor. The Overseer's electro-whip crackled menacingly. "I said move." Before the whip could connect, a sharp voice echoed through the tunnel. "Overseer Grax, I believe that would interfere with my research parameters." Dr. Catherine Walsh stepped into view, her environmental suit pristine white against the grimy tunnel walls. The human scientist had arrived at the station 3 cycles ago, officially to study efficient labor management techniques in extrasolar mining operations. She carried herself with the confidence of someone used to moving through academic circles rather than mining tunnels. Grax's tendrils twisted in annoyance. "Dr. Walsh, this specimen's productivity has dropped 12% below acceptable levels. The consortium's protocols are clear. And my research grant from the Terran Alliance Science Division is clear about maintaining consistent working conditions throughout the study period." Dr. Walsh's voice remained level, but Vena detected a hint of steel beneath the professional tone. "Random variables like physical punishment would contaminate my data set." Vena kept her head down, continuing to work while the two argued. She'd learned long ago that drawing attention only led to pain. But something about the human's presence made her sensitive antennae twitch. There was a peculiar energy pattern around Dr. Walsh, different from the brutish satisfaction she sensed from the overseers or the desperate resignation from her fellow slaves. "Very well," Grax growled. "But if production quotas aren't met, you'll need to find another specimen for your studies." He slithered away, leaving behind the acrid smell of his species' anger pheromones. Dr. Walsh approached Vena's workstation, ostensibly examining the crystal formation in the rock face. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "That neural inhibitor, does it monitor audio?" Vena froze. No one had ever asked her about the device directly. She gave a slight shake of her head, careful to keep drilling. "Good. Listen carefully. I'm not here to study mining efficiency. I'm gathering evidence of slavery violations against the Terran-Solaran Cooperation Treaty. But I need your help." The plasma drill slipped, nearly grazing Vena's arm. In 20 years, no one had ever offered help. The concept seemed as alien as the strange human standing before her. "I know you have no reason to trust me," Dr. Walsh continued, pulling out a scanner and pretending to take readings. "But I've seen what they're doing here. It stops with this generation. No more Solarian children torn from their homes." Vena's secondary heart began beating faster, its rhythm falling out of sync with her primary one, a sign of extreme emotional distress in her species. Memory fragments flashed through her mind, her own daughter, barely past her first molting, being loaded onto a different slave ship. The raiders had separated families deliberately, knowing it broke any will to resist. "My daughter," Vena whispered, her voice rough from disuse. Most slaves stopped speaking eventually, finding it easier to survive without reminders of who they once were. They took her to another facility. Dr. Walsh's expression remained neutral, but her energy pattern flared with what Venna recognized as controlled anger. "What's her name?" "Lyria." The name felt like a prayer on Venna's tongue. She would be 22 cycles now. "I have contacts throughout this sector. Once we document what's happening here, we can start tracking other facilities." Dr. Walsh adjusted something on her scanner. "But I need you to survive until then. Can you do that?" Venna's hands steadied on the drill. For the first time in 20 years, she felt something beyond the dull fog of survival. It was dangerous. Hope always was in places like this. But the human's energy pattern showed no deception, only determination and carefully controlled rage at what she'd witnessed. "Yes," Venna whispered. "I can survive." "Good. I'll be conducting regular inspections of this section. We'll talk more then." Dr. Walsh raised her voice to normal levels. "Fascinating crystal formation. The resonance patterns here could definitely improve efficiency if properly mapped." She strode away, her white suit soon swallowed by the tunnel's shadows. Venna returned to her work, but something had changed. The neural inhibitor seemed to weigh less heavily, and the crystal dust in her throat felt more like a temporary discomfort than a slowly executed death sentence. That night, in the cramped sleeping pod she shared with 3 other Solarians, Venna did something she hadn't done since her capture. She hummed a lullaby, the same one she used to sing to Lyria. The other slaves stirred, their antennae twitching in recognition of the ancient melody. One by one, they joined in, their voices barely above a whisper. The sound wove through the pod block, a hidden act of defiance against the machinery of slavery. For the first time in decades, Venna fell asleep not to the sound of muffled sobs or pained breathing, but to the songs of her people. Tomorrow would bring more crystal dust, more pain, more quotas. But now there was something else too, a fragile tendril of hope, as delicate as the light-sensitive vines she once tended on Solara. And like those vines, with proper nurturing, it could grow strong enough to crack even the hardest stone. Over the next 3 weeks, Dr. Walsh's visits became the anchor points of Venna's existence. The human would appear during different shifts, her presence carefully timed to appear random to the overseers. Each interaction was a delicate dance of hidden conversations beneath the guise of scientific observation. The quantum crystal formations respond to bioelectric fields, Dr. Walsh explained loudly one day, her scanner hovering near Venna's work area. Her true words, whispered beneath the drone of mining equipment, told a different story. 3 more Terran Alliance ships have positioned themselves in nearby systems. When the time comes, they'll be ready. Venna kept her antennae still, betraying no reaction as she worked. She'd learned to respond in the brief moments when the overseer's attention wavered. The KTHLRI have defense systems. Automated response platforms. We know. Their targeting systems rely on quantum messaging. Interesting how they use the very crystals you mine to maintain their control. Walsh's scanner beeped, a convenient cover for their conversation. But systems can be disrupted, especially with inside knowledge. The humans' visits brought more than just plans for liberation. During their carefully disguised conversations, Walsh shared stories of Earth's history, of humanity's long struggle to abolish slavery in their own society. The parallels to Venna's people stirred something deep within her, a sense of connection to a larger struggle that stretched across species and star systems. One rest period, Venna found a small data chip hidden in her food ration. Later, in her sleeping pod, she carefully activated it against her palm, using her species' natural ability to interface with energy patterns. Historical images flickered in her mind, human slaves breaking their chains, underground networks helping others escape, lawmakers finally declaring the practice illegal. The message was clear, change was possible, even if it took generations. But hope, Venna discovered, was a double-edged blade. As her awareness grew, so did the pain of witnessing the continued suffering around her. In the communal washing station, she caught glimpses of fresh wounds on her fellow slaves, saw how the younger one's eyes grew duller with each passing cycle. The neural inhibitor at the base of her skull seemed to grow heavier with each new understanding of the depth of their oppression. "Your productivity has improved," Overseer Grax noted during an inspection, his tentacles writhing with suspicious satisfaction. "Perhaps the human's research has some value after all." "The specimen responds well to structured observation," Dr. Walsh interjected, her professional mask firmly in place. Only Venna could sense the carefully controlled rage beneath the scientist's calm exterior. Each documented abuse, each recorded violation, fed that rage like fuel being added to a star about to go supernova. During their brief exchanges, Walsh revealed more of the wider picture. The Terran Alliance had been building a case against the KTHLRE mining consortium for years, but needed irrefutable evidence of treaty violations. Previous attempts to infiltrate the mining operations had failed. The KTHLRE were paranoid about human interference. "That's why they allowed my research request," Walsh explained during one inspection. "They think they're gathering data on human scientific methods, staying ahead of potential competition. Their arrogance is their weakness." The hardest part was maintaining the facade of broken submission. When a young Solarian collapsed from crystal dust exposure, Venna had to force herself not to rush to his aid. She watched, antennae rigid with suppressed emotion, as the overseers dragged him away. That night, Dr. Walsh's data included detailed scans of his condition, one more piece of evidence for the case being built. The other slaves began to notice changes in Venna. Her posture, while still appropriately submissive, held a core of strength that hadn't been there before. During rest periods, she would sometimes hum fragments of old Solarian songs, songs of resistance and survival that many had forgotten. Slowly, cautiously, others began to remember too. "We're teaching the young ones our history," she whispered to Walsh during one inspection. "In ways the overseers can't detect. Through melodies, through patterns in the way we move. Our culture survives." Walsh's scanner trembled slightly, the only sign of her emotional response. Culture is resilient. Earth's enslaved peoples did the same thing. They kept their stories alive through songs, through coded messages, through seemingly innocent gestures that held deeper meaning. The turning point came during a routine crystal extraction. Venna's sensitive antennae detected an instability in the tunnel wall before the mining sensors could respond. Without thinking, she pulled a young slave named Trell away from his workstation moments before a section of the ceiling collapsed. Overseer Grax's electrowhip crackled to life. "Return to your assigned position immediately." But Dr. Walsh was already there, her white environmental suit dusty from the cave-in. Remarkable. The specimen's natural sensitivity to energy patterns predicted the structural failure. This could revolutionize safety protocols. Her voice carried just the right mix of scientific excitement and corporate interest. "Imagine the potential cost savings in prevented equipment damage alone." The overseer's whip powered down reluctantly. Venna returned to her position, but she caught the quick glance of gratitude from Trell. More importantly, she saw how other slaves stood slightly straighter, moved with slightly more purpose. The incident had demonstrated something vital: their people's gifts, which the KTHLRE exploited, could also be a source of power. That night, in the quiet of her sleeping pod, Venna reflected on how much had changed in just 3 weeks. The neural inhibitor still hummed its constant reminder of captivity, but it no longer defined her existence. Like the quantum crystals she mined, she had developed new facets, hidden depths that the overseers couldn't see. She thought of her daughter Lyria, somewhere out there in the vast expanse of space. The pain of separation was still acute, but it was now accompanied by something else: determination. If they succeeded here, it would create a precedent, a legal framework for challenging other mining operations. Every documented abuse, every recorded violation, was one step closer to a universe where no more Solarian children would be torn from their parents. As she drifted off to sleep, Vena's antennae picked up the faint energy patterns of her fellow slaves, their bioelectric fields harmonizing in the darkness. Even with their neural inhibitors, they were beginning to resonate with a frequency their captors couldn't detect or understand. It was the frequency of hope, of resistance, of a people remembering who they were meant to be. Tomorrow would bring more tests, more careful deceptions, more moments of having to watch suffering they weren't yet ready to prevent. But for now, in the quiet hours between work shifts, something new was taking root in the harsh soil of their captivity. Like the ancient light vines of Solara, it would only grow stronger in the darkness. The breaking point came not with a bang, but with a whisper. During the third shift of the mining cycle, a new group of slaves arrived at station K-379. Among them was a Solarian female whose energy pattern made Vena's antennae freeze in recognition. Though the newcomer's once iridescent skin had dulled to a sickly gray, though her frame had grown gaunt from years of hardship, there was no mistaking it, this was Nira, Vena's clutch sister from the agricultural colony. Vena's plasma drill trembled in her hands as she watched the new arrivals being processed. The neural inhibitors were installed with brutal efficiency, each slave's scream echoing through the processing chamber. She forced herself to keep working, even as her secondary heart pounded out of rhythm with suppressed emotion. Dr. Walsh arrived moments later, her pristine environmental suit a stark contrast to the grime-covered slaves. Fascinating adaptation of the neural suppression technology, she commented loudly, scanner whirring. But her eyes met Vena's, registering the distress in her alien features. The new arrival, Vena whispered when the overseer moved away. She's my clutch sister. We grew up together in the lightvine fields. Walsh's scanner stilled for a fraction of a second. This complicates things. We're still 2 weeks away from the planned extraction. Before Vena could respond, a commotion erupted from the processing area. Nira had broken free from the restraints, her natural Solarian agility allowing her to dodge the first grab of the security drones. She made it halfway across the chamber before the neural inhibitor activated, dropping her to the ground in convulsions. Overseer Grax slithered forward, electro-whip humming with deadly energy. Defiance must be corrected immediately. Let this serve as a reminder. The whip descended, its energy field slicing through Nira's already battered flesh. Something snapped inside Vena. 20 years of carefully suppressed rage, of watching her people suffer, of dreaming about her lost daughter, it all crystallized into a single moment of clarity. Her plasma drill was moving before she made the conscious decision. The superheated tool arced through the air, striking the power coupling for the chamber's main lighting system. Sparks exploded in a cascade of electrical feedback, plunging the area into darkness. In the chaos that followed, Vena's natural ability to sense energy patterns became a weapon. She navigated through the darkness with precision, reaching Nira's crumpled form. The other slaves, whether through instinct or planned resistance, began moving in patterns that confused the security drone's tracking systems. Commence emergency lockdown. Grax's voice cut through the darkness. Activate all neural inhibitors at maximum power. The pain when it came was beyond anything Vena had experienced in 20 years of slavery. The neural inhibitor felt like it was trying to tear her consciousness apart. Through the agony, she felt Nira's hand grasp hers, their antennae touching in the ancient gesture of familial bond. Then, suddenly, the pain stopped. The neural inhibitor went dead, along with every other piece of KTHLRE technology in the chamber. In the emergency lighting that followed, Vena saw Dr. Walsh standing by the main control panel, her scanner revealing itself as something far more sophisticated than a simple research tool. The consortium's systems are temporarily disabled, Walsh announced, her professional facade giving way to tactical precision. But we have less than 10 minutes before their redundancies kick in. Security teams from the upper levels are already responding. She moved quickly to where Vena and Nira huddled. This wasn't how we planned it, but plans change. The Terran Alliance ship is already moving into position, but we need to get to the emergency shuttle bay on level 3. Vena helped Nira to her feet, supporting her clutch sister's weight. Around them, other slaves were already moving, their long-suppressed instincts for survival kicking in. The younger ones helped the elderly, while those with mining experience led the way through the darkened tunnels. "The overseers will expect us to go up," Venna said, her voice stronger than she'd ever heard it. "But there's another way. Through the lower maintenance shafts. They're toxic without protection, but our people can survive longer than the KTHLRI in those conditions." Walsh nodded sharply. "Show me." What followed was a nightmare journey through the station's underbelly. The maintenance shafts were narrow tubes filled with crystalline dust and toxic gas, barely maintained by automated systems. Venna led the way, her antennae guiding them through the maze of energy signatures. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of the KTHLRI security teams in pursuit. Not everyone made it. Some slaves, too weakened by years of abuse, couldn't keep up. Others succumbed to the toxic atmosphere. Each loss felt like a physical blow to Venna, but she forced herself to keep moving. She had to believe their sacrifices would mean something, that their deaths would help break the cycle of slavery. They were halfway to the shuttle bay when Overseer Grax's voice echoed through the emergency channels. "Attention, human vessel approaching mining station K-379. This is a sovereign KTHLRI facility. Any attempt to interfere will be considered an act of war." Walsh pulled out a communication device hidden in her environmental suit. "Captain Reeves, are you receiving?" "Loud and clear, Doctor," a calm human voice responded. "We're picking up multiple weapon systems activating on the station. Things are about to get interesting." The station shuddered as the first exchanges of fire began far above them. Venna felt Nira's grip on her arm tighten. "The light vines," her clutch sister whispered, her first words since the escape began. "Remember how they would reach for the smallest gap in the cave roofs? How they always found a way through?" Venna's antennae brushed against her sister's in understanding. Their people had evolved alongside the light-seeking vines of Solara, developing the same tenacious drive to find paths to freedom. Now, in the bowels of a space station far from home, they were doing the same. They reached a junction where the shaft split into 3 directions. Security teams were closing in from above, their heavy footsteps echoing through the metal corridors. Venna closed her eyes, extending her senses to their limit. Among the chaos of energy signatures, she detected something familiar, the quantum crystal resonance from the mining levels. "This way," she said with certainty. "The crystals will mask our biosignatures from their scanners." As they pressed on through the toxic darkness, Venna felt something shift in the station's energy field. The neural inhibitors, dead until now, were starting to reactivate. They had minutes at most before the KTHLRI regained full control of their systems. But they had come too far to stop now. Freedom was ahead, through the poison and darkness, past the security teams and automated defenses. Like the light vines of their homeworld, they would find their way through any gap, any weakness, reaching always toward the light. The story of their escape was about to be written in fire and blood, in courage and sacrifice, in the unbreakable spirit of a people who refused to remain enslaved. And Venna, who had spent 20 years in chains, was ready to help write it. The shuttle bay doors loomed before them, a massive barrier between slavery and freedom. The toxic maintenance shafts had taken them as far as they could go, leaving 40 meters of open space to cross. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew closer, punctuated by the distant thunder of space combat as the Terran Alliance vessel engaged the station's defense systems. Dr. Walsh's environmental suit was failing, its filters clogged by the crystalline dust they'd traveled through. She pulled off her helmet, exposing herself to the station's harsh atmosphere. "The emergency override for the bay doors is on the far control panel," she said between coughs. "But they'll have security drones watching it." Venna surveyed the open space, her antennae detecting multiple energy signatures. 17 drones, she confirmed. "And something else. Overseer Grax. He's waiting." Nira, still weak but standing on her own, touched Vena's arm. The overseers never understood why our people were such good crystal miners. They thought it was just about sensing energy patterns. Understanding flowed between the Clutch sisters. On Solara, their ancestors had developed their abilities not just to find the light vines, but to communicate with them, to shape their growth through subtle manipulations of energy. The same sensitivity that made them valuable slaves could be turned to other purposes. The quantum crystals in the drone's guidance systems, Vena whispered. We can disrupt them. Walsh nodded grimly. Do it. The Alliance ship won't be able to hold off their reinforcements much longer. The group of escaped slaves gathered in the shadows of the maintenance shaft exit. There were 23 of them left, each bearing the scars of their captivity, each now burning with the possibility of freedom. They linked hands, forming a circle with Vena and Nira at its heart. What happened next would later be described in bureaucratic reports as an unprecedented manipulation of quantum field harmonics. But for those who witnessed it, it was more like a song, the combined energy of 23 Solarian minds reaching out to touch the crystalline matrices that powered the station's technology. The security drones began to spin erratically, their quantum processors thrown into chaos by the subtle frequencies being woven around them. Some crashed into each other, while others flew into walls or ceiling fixtures. In the confusion, Walsh sprinted for the control panel, her fingers flying over the interface. No. Overseer Grax's voice boomed through the chamber as he emerged from hiding. You primitive species dare to turn our technology against us. His tentacles writhed with rage as he aimed a quantum pulse weapon at the group. The blast that followed should have killed them all. But Vena, deep in the shared consciousness of her people's energy manipulation, sensed it coming. The quantum crystals in the weapon's core responded to their combined will, redirecting the deadly pulse into the ceiling. Debris rained down as the bay's structural integrity was compromised. Warning klaxons blared throughout the station. Hull breach imminent, the automated system announced. Emergency containment protocols initiated. The bay doors began to slide open, responding to Walsh's override commands. Beyond them, Vena caught her first glimpse of open space in 20 years, and of the battle being waged there. The Terran Alliance vessel was executing intricate evasive maneuvers, its point defense systems blazing as it held off the station's automated defenses. The shuttle. Walsh shouted over the chaos. We need to move now. They ran. There was no coordination, no plan beyond the desperate sprint across the exposed bay. Grax fired again, but his weapon's crystals were still resonating with the Solarian's influence, its shots going wild. One blast caught a young male in the leg, and 2 others stopped to help him. Vena reached the shuttle first, her hands finding the external access panel. Years of working with mining equipment had taught her the basic patterns of power systems. The door slid open, and she began helping others inside. Incoming. Walsh's warning came just as a fresh wave of security drones poured in from an adjacent chamber. These ones had different energy signatures, backup units with older, non-crystal technology. Their weapons opened fire, filling the air with deadly plasma bolts. Nira pushed a group of younger slaves behind a cargo container. Like the dust storms on Solara, she called out. Remember the Lightvine shelters. The survivors responded instinctively, using the scattered cargo and equipment as cover, moving in the unpredictable patterns they'd once used to navigate their homeworld's violent storms. More made it to the shuttle, but not all. Each loss felt like a physical blow to Vena, names and faces searing themselves into her memory. Walsh had reached the shuttle's cockpit, her fingers dancing across the controls. The main engines are cold, she reported. We need 3 minutes to build enough power for launch. We don't have 3 minutes, Vena replied, watching as more security forces converged on their position. Among them she saw Grax, his tentacles now encased in combat armor, advancing with murderous purpose. Then inspiration struck. The quantum crystals in the bay, she said. There are storage crates of them here, waiting for transport. If we overload their resonance patterns all at once. Understanding dawned in Walsh's eyes. It would create a massive energy surge. Enough to jumpstart the engines immediately. And disable their weapons, Neera added. But the feedback, anyone linking with that many crystals at once. Venna met her clutch sister's gaze. I'll do it. No, Neera grabbed her arm. Your daughter is still out there. You need to find her. Her antennae brushed Venna's one last time. I never had children. Let me give meaning to these years of slavery. Before anyone could stop her, Neera sprinted toward the crystal storage area. Her antennae extended fully, channeling more power than any Solarian was meant to handle. The air itself seemed to vibrate as she accessed hundreds of quantum crystals simultaneously. The results were catastrophic. Energy cascaded through the bay in visible waves, overloading every piece of technology it touched. The security forces' weapons exploded in their hands. The shuttle's engines roared to life, power readings jumping to maximum. And in the center of it all, Neera burned like a star-going supernova. Go, she screamed, her voice distorted by the energy coursing through her. Live free, clutch sister. Find your daughter. The shuttle lifted off as the bay descended into chaos. The last thing Venna saw before the doors closed was Overseer Grax and his forces being thrown back by waves of quantum energy, and at the heart of the maelstrom, her clutch sisters formed dissolving into pure light. They burst from the bay like a missile, riding the wave of quantum disruption that had disabled the station's close-range defenses. Above them, the Terran Alliance vessel moved into position, extending its shield bubble to protect them from the station's remaining weapons. As they accelerated away from K-379, Venna felt tears freezing on her cheeks. They had won their freedom, but the cost had been enormous. Yet even through the grief, she felt something else, determination. Neera's sacrifice would not be in vain. Somewhere out there, Lyria was still a slave, and now Venna was finally in a position to find her. The shuttle's viewport showed the station receding behind them, its dark bulk outlined against the star field. 16 Solarian slaves had made it aboard, each now tasting their first moments of freedom. Their antennae moved in shared mourning for those left behind, but also in determination. They were free, and they would make that freedom count. Course laid in for the Alliance rendezvous point, Walsh announced from the cockpit. We'll be under their protection in 17 minutes. Venna stood at the viewport, watching the stars. Somewhere out there was her daughter, and countless other slaves still in chains. But now they had hope. Now they had proof that freedom was possible. Now they had a story to tell, a story of resistance, sacrifice, and the unquenchable spirit of a people who refused to be broken. The neural inhibitor, dead and useless at the base of her skull, would be removed soon. But Venna had already broken its true hold over her. She was free, and she would make sure others would be too, no matter how long it took. 5 years after the escape from mining station K-379, Venna stood before the Interstellar Council on Sentient Rights. The chamber's curved walls were lined with representatives from 100 different species, their varied forms a testament to the diversity of civilized space. Her antennae detected the complex web of energy patterns created by so many different forms of consciousness gathered in one place. The neural inhibitor scar at the base of her skull had long since healed, but she still touched it occasionally, a reminder of who she was and what she had survived. Her skin had regained its natural iridescence, shifting with subtle colors as she moved to the speaker's podium. She wore traditional Solarian robes, their intricate patterns telling the story of her people's journey from slavery to freedom. Honored representatives, she began, her voice clear and strong. I come before you not just as a survivor, but as a witness. The evidence we present today documents 372 illegal mining operations run by the KTHLRA Mining Consortium, holding an estimated 40,000 sentient beings in conditions of slavery. The chamber's holographic displays activated, showing the results of 5 years of careful investigation. Dr. Walsh, now Director Walsh of the Terran Alliance Anti-Slavery Task Force, stood at a secondary podium, coordinating the presentation of evidence. The friendship between the human and Solarian had deepened into a powerful partnership, their combined efforts reshaping the legal landscape of interstellar labor rights. Each .UC represents a facility we have confirmed through survivor testimony, undercover documentation, or financial records, Venna continued. Each one holds people like myself, like my clutch sister Nira, who sacrificed her life so others could be free. Each one holds someone's child, someone's parent, someone's hope for the future. She thought of Nira often, especially in moments like this. Her clutch sister's sacrifice had become a symbol for the resistance movement that had grown in the years since their escape. The quantum energy burst that had covered their flight had done more than just disable the station's systems, it had sent a pulse of hope through the entire sector, inspiring other acts of resistance. The evidence presentation reached its climax with the financial data, the piece that would prove most damaging to the consortium. Their own records betray them, Venna explained. Every credit transferred, every asset moved, every slave bought and sold, it all leaves traces. Traces that lead us to the truth, and to justice. She paused, her antennae detecting a familiar energy pattern entering the chamber. A young Solarian female walked in, her iridescent skin showing the subtle patterns of recent healing. Their eyes met across the chamber, and both their secondary hearts skipped a beat in perfect synchronization. Lyria. Her daughter. Found 3 months ago in a mining facility on the Outer Rim, one of 17 slaves freed in a joint Terran-Solarian operation. She was no longer the child Venna remembered, but a grown woman shaped by her own experiences of survival and resistance. Drawing strength from her daughter's presence, Venna delivered the final part of her testimony. The KTHLRE Mining Consortium claims they are merely operating within the boundaries of local laws and customs. They hide behind shell companies and bureaucratic confusion. But slavery has no customs. Torture has no laws. The breaking of sentient beings has no boundaries that we are bound to respect. The chamber erupted in discussion, hundreds of translator units working overtime as representatives debated the evidence. But Venna knew they had won. The financial data was irrefutable, the testimony too powerful to ignore. The consortium's days of operating with impunity were over. After the session, in a quiet garden designed to accommodate multiple species' needs for reflection, Venna and Lyria sat together. Their antennae gently touched, sharing the complex emotions that words couldn't fully express. Dr. Walsh joined them, her presence a comfortable reminder of how this journey had begun. The council will vote tomorrow, Walsh said, her voice confident. With the evidence we've presented, they'll have no choice but to authorize the task force to move against all known consortium facilities. Lyria's antennae twitched with concern. The KTHLRE will resist. There will be violence. Yes, Venna agreed, thinking of Nira and all the others who had died for this moment. But we're ready. The underground network we've built reaches every facility. When the task force moves in, they'll find the slaves already organizing, already preparing for freedom. They had spent 5 years building that network, using the same skills that had made them valuable to their captors. The Solarians' ability to sense and manipulate energy patterns had become a powerful tool for resistance. They could detect surveillance, coordinate actions, and share information in ways the overseers could never understand. The light vines of Solara, Lyria said softly, remembering the stories Venna had shared since their reunion. They never grow alone. Each vine connects to others, sharing nutrients, sharing strength. Venna smiled, seeing the wisdom her daughter had gained through her own trials. Yes. And now our people do the same. Every freed slave becomes a link in the chain, helping others find their way to freedom. The garden's artificial sunlight began to dim, simulating evening. In the softer light, Venna could almost imagine they were back on Solara, surrounded by the light vines that had shaped their species' evolution. But they had evolved further now, shaped by hardship into something stronger than their ancestors could have imagined. Tomorrow's vote is just the beginning, Walsh reminded them. There will be other mining consortiums, other species who think they can profit from slavery. The fight never really ends. No, Venna agreed, touching the scar where her neural inhibitor had been. But neither does the resistance. Neither does hope. She looked at her daughter, seeing in her the future they had fought so hard to create. We carry the light of freedom within us now, and like the vines of our homeworld, we will always reach toward it, always find a way to grow. That evening, in her quarters in the council complex, Venna recorded another entry in the archive she had been building. It was a collection of stories, of escape, of resistance, of survival. Each one a testament to the strength of those who refused to be broken, who found ways to remain themselves even in the darkest places. She wrote of Neera's sacrifice, of the 16 who had escaped with her that day, of the hundreds they had helped free since then. She wrote of Dr. Walsh and the humans who had chosen to stand with them, proving that compassion could bridge the gulf between species. She wrote of her daughter, found against all odds, and of the new generation of Solarians who would grow up knowing only freedom. But most of all, she wrote of hope. Of how it could survive 20 years of slavery, could spark in the darkness of a mining tunnel, could spread through a people like light through the branches of a vine. How it could transform itself from a dangerous dream into a powerful reality. The next day, the council would vote. Laws would change, ships would launch, and more slaves would taste freedom. But the real victory had already been won, in the hearts and minds of those who had dared to hope, dared to resist, dared to reach always toward the light. Venna's story, once a tale of slavery, had become something else, a beacon, a guide, a promise that chains could be broken, that freedom could be won, that the darkness could be pushed back one light at a time. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.